Island of the Dolls. In the 1950s, deep inside the canals of Xochimilco, south of Mexico City, a small island began to change in a way no official map could explain. The island was not a fortress, not a prison, and not a forgotten military site. It was a quiet patch of trees and swamp water, surrounded by narrow canals where boats moved slowly through floating gardens. But, according to local accounts, a man named Don Julian Santana Barrera left ordinary life behind and chose to live there alone. What he brought to the island was not machinery, not weapons, and not treasure. He brought dolls. The story most often told begins with a drowning. A young girl was said to have died in the dark water near the island, though the details remain uncertain and difficult to verify. Some versions claim Don Julian found the body. Others say he only discovered a doll floating near the canal afterward. What matters is what he believed. Don Julian reportedly became convinced that the girl's spirit had not left the island. The doll, to him, was not trash carried by the current. It was a sign. From that moment, Isla de las Muñecas slowly turned into something that looked less like a home and more like a warning. Don Julian began collecting discarded dolls from canals, garbage piles, markets, and nearby neighborhoods. He tied them to branches. He nailed them to trunks. He hung them from wires, fences, and wooden structures. Over time, the island filled with broken plastic faces, missing limbs, cracked eyelids, faded dresses, and hair stiffened by rain and dust. Some dolls had empty eye sockets. Some stared sideways from the trees. Others hung upside down, as if frozen in the middle of a silent fall. The physical details made the island worse than any simple ghost story. These were not clean toys placed carefully on shelves. They were damaged objects exposed to heat, insects, humidity, and years of canal air. Their skin turned gray and brown. Their clothing rotted into thin strips. Mold gathered around their mouths. Spiders nested inside their heads. When wind moved through the trees, the dolls shifted slightly, their plastic bodies tapping against branches like small bones. Visitors later claimed the island seemed to watch them from every direction. But the most disturbing part was Don Julian himself. He was said to believe the dolls protected him from the spirit of the drowned girl, or perhaps pleased the spirit enough to keep it calm. Each new doll became another offering, another attempt to answer a presence only he could feel. People who encountered him described a man living inside a private ritual that no one else fully understood. To outsiders, the island looked like obsession. To Don Julian, it may have felt like survival. Then the legend grew darker. In 2001, Don Julian was reportedly found dead near the same area of water where the girl was believed to have drowned. For those who knew the story, the coincidence was impossible to ignore. A man had spent decades covering an island with dolls to appease a spirit, only to die near the very place that started the fear. The official explanation did not need ghosts. Age, isolation, and the danger of the canals were enough. But legends do not survive because they are proven. Legends survive because they fit too perfectly around the facts people cannot forget. Today, Isla de las Muñecas is visited by tourists, photographers, skeptics, and believers. Many come expecting a strange attraction, but the island does not feel like a staged haunted house. It feels like the remains of one man's long conversation with something unseen. The dolls are still there, weathered and silent, turning the island into a place where childhood objects no longer comfort anyone. If the story is only folklore, then it reveals how grief can transform a landscape into a shrine of fear. But if Don Julian truly believed he was answering a presence in the water, then the real question becomes colder. Was the island of the dolls built to honor the dead, or to keep something from coming closer? Poveglia Island. In 1793, in the Venetian lagoon of northern Italy, a small island between Venice and the Adriatic routes became something far more disturbing than a lonely patch of land. Poveglia Island was not isolated by distance alone. It sat close enough to civilization to be seen as useful, yet far enough away to receive what the city did not want to keep inside its walls. During a time when disease could move faster than explanation, ships, passengers, and bodies were pushed toward places like Poveglia. The island became a boundary between the living city and the fear of infection. Once someone was sent there, the return was never guaranteed. The landscape itself seemed designed for dread. Poveglia was not a dramatic mountain island or a tropical place swallowed by jungle. It was flat, damp and exposed, surrounded by gray water and the slow movement of lagoon fog. Brick buildings rose from the island with the cold geometry of utility, not beauty. Narrow windows looked out over the water like watchful openings. Stone walls absorbed salt, rain, and silence. The bell tower stood above the ruins like a marker for a settlement that had lost its purpose. In daylight, the island looked abandoned. In bad weather, Poveglia looked as if the lagoon had been trying to erase Poveglia for centuries. The darkest layer of the island came from its association with quarantine. Venice had long understood that ships could carry more than cargo. Plague, fever, and panic could arrive by sea, hidden inside bodies before symptoms appeared. Islands became tools of separation. People suspected of carrying disease could be removed from the city and placed where the water itself worked like a wall. Whether every extreme legend about Poveglia is accurate remains disputed, but the core fear is easy to understand. An island used for isolation does not need ghosts to become terrifying. The isolation already contains the horror. Over time, stories attach themselves to Poveglia with unusual force. Local legends claimed the soil held the memory of mass death. Some accounts allege that plague victims were burned there, buried there, or left there when the city had no safer answer. The numbers often repeated in popular retellings are difficult to verify, and that uncertainty may be part of why the island became so powerful. When records are incomplete, imagination fills the empty spaces. A quarantine island becomes a grave. A grave becomes a haunted place. A haunted place becomes a warning. Then the island's reputation shifted again. In the 20th century, Poveglia was associated with a hospital complex, and later, stories turned the abandoned medical buildings into the center of even darker claims. Rumors spread about patients, experiments, screams, and a doctor whose own fate became part of the legend. Skeptics can question many of these details, but the physical setting makes the rumors feel strangely believable. Empty corridors, peeling walls, rusting bed frames. Rooms once meant for treatment now filled with rot and birds. When a place already carries the history of isolation, every broken window begins to look like evidence. Authorities eventually restricted access, and the island became even more mysterious because ordinary visitors could not simply walk its paths. Poveglia remained visible but unreachable, close to Venice yet psychologically sealed away. That is one reason the island continues to disturb people. Poveglia does not feel like a fantasy hidden at the end of the world. Poveglia feels like something placed just outside the edge of civilization, because civilization needed somewhere to put its fear. The consequences of Poveglia are not only found in ghost stories. The island reveals how societies react when death becomes contagious, when compassion collapses under panic, and when isolation becomes policy. If the legends are exaggerated, they still grew from a real human instinct. The instinct to send danger somewhere else and then avoid looking back. But if even a fraction of what people whisper about Poveglia is true, then the island is more than abandoned land in a lagoon. It is a place where the living once tried to bury fear, and fear learned how to remain. North Brother Island. In 1885, in the East River between the Bronx and Rikers Island, New York opened a hospital on a small island that most residents of the city would never visit, but many would learn to fear. North Brother Island was not far from Manhattan's crowded streets, yet the water around North Brother Island made the place feel removed from ordinary life. The island was only about 20 acres, covered in trees, brick buildings, narrow paths, and hospital wards built for one purpose: to separate the sick from the healthy. It was close enough for the city to use, but distant enough for the city to forget. The Riverside Hospital was moved there to treat contagious diseases: smallpox, tuberculosis, typhus, scarlet fever, and other illnesses passed through its wards at different points in its history. In an age before modern antibiotics, before advanced public health systems, and before many people understood infection clearly, disease could turn a city into a trap. North Brother Island became part medical facility, part quarantine zone, and part human storage site. Patients were not simply treated there. They were removed from public sight. The island's buildings had the heavy, practical look of institutional architecture. Red brick walls stood behind overgrown trees. Tall windows allowed light into rooms where patients waited, coughed, recovered, or died. Corridors connected wards like arteries inside a body built for containment. From the river, North Brother Island did not look like a place of healing. It looked like a forbidden settlement, surrounded by gray water. A place where the city sent people when fear became stronger than comfort. The most infamous figure connected to North Brother Island was Mary Mallon, later known as Typhoid Mary. In 1907, health authorities identified her as an asymptomatic carrier of typhoid fever. She looked healthy, but she was believed to have infected others while working as a cook. After refusing to stop cooking or cooperate with medical restrictions, she was forcibly isolated on North Brother Island. She spent years there, was later released, and then was returned to the island in 1915 after another outbreak was linked to her work. Mary Mallon remained on North Brother Island until her death in 1938. Her story made the island more than a quarantine site. It turned North Brother Island into a symbol of a terrifying question. How far can society go when one person is seen as a danger to everyone else? Mary Mallon was not a monster in the supernatural sense. She was a human being trapped between personal freedom and public fear. To some, she was reckless. To others, she was a victim of a system that did not know how to handle invisible danger. North Brother Island became the place where that conflict was locked away. But disease was not the only darkness surrounding the island. In 1904, the General Slocum steamship caught fire in the East River near North Brother Island. More than 1,000 people died, many of them women and children from a German-American church community. The island became part of one of New York City's deadliest disasters. Survivors and bodies were brought toward its shores. For a place already associated with sickness and separation, the tragedy added another layer of grief. After the hospital era, North Brother Island was used for other purposes, including housing for World War II veterans and later a rehabilitation center for young drug users. By the 1960s, the island was abandoned. The buildings were left to rot. Trees pushed through roofs. Vines covered walls. Floors collapsed under decades of moisture. Birds nested in rooms where patients once slept. Nature began reclaiming the island, but the decay did not erase its history. It made the history feel hidden under leaves. Today, access to North Brother Island is restricted, partly because the island has become a protected nesting area for birds. That restriction gives the place a strange modern silence. New York City surrounds it with bridges, traffic, towers, and noise, yet North Brother Island remains mostly unreachable. The island is not remote in miles, it is remote in memory. The consequence of North Brother Island is not only that people suffered there. The deeper consequence is that the island shows what fear can build when danger cannot be seen. A city created a place for infection, exile, disaster, and rehabilitation, then abandoned the evidence behind locked shores. If North Brother Island is haunted, it may not be by ghosts alone. It may be haunted by every person who was sent there because the world outside had no better answer. And if a place can sit in the middle of one of the busiest cities on Earth and still remain forgotten, what else has been hidden in plain sight? Hashima Island. In 1974, about 9 miles off the coast of Nagasaki, Japan, an island that had once been crowded with thousands of workers suddenly went silent. Hashima Island had not been a village built slowly by tradition. It had been engineered, expanded, and hardened into a fortress of industry. From the sea, Hashima looked like a battleship made of concrete, with tall seawalls, stacked apartment blocks, narrow courtyards, stairways, school buildings, shops, and mining structures pressed into a space of only about 16 acres. For decades, the island had been alive with coal, smoke, machinery, and human labor. Then the mine closed, the residents left, and the entire place was abandoned almost overnight. Hashima Island was also known as Gunkanjima, meaning Battleship Island, because of its sharp industrial silhouette. The island's outer walls rose from the water like armored plating. Inside those walls, reinforced concrete towers stood close together, their windows facing the ocean like hundreds of empty eyes. At its peak, Hashima held one of the highest population densities in the world. Families lived in compact apartments. Children went to school above the mine. Workers descended beneath the seabed to extract coal from tunnels stretching deep under the ocean floor. The island was not merely surrounded by water. The island's economy depended on men entering the darkness below that water every day. The physical reality of Hashima was already oppressive. There was almost no open land. The buildings were packed tightly together to resist typhoons and sea wind. Residents lived under constant exposure to salt, storms, and industrial noise. Coal dust settled into clothing, lungs, walls, and machines. The ocean battered the seawalls while miners worked far below the surface, where heat, darkness, gas, and collapse were constant threats. To outsiders, Hashima may have seemed like proof of modern industrial power. To those who labored there, the island may have felt like a machine that never fully released them. The darker legacy of Hashima comes from its wartime history. During the Second World War, forced laborers from Korea and other regions were brought to work in Japan's industrial sites, including coal mines connected to places like Hashima. Survivors and historians have described harsh conditions, dangerous work, hunger, abuse, and deaths that were long overshadowed by the island's later image as a dramatic ruin. This is where Hashima becomes more than an abandoned industrial island. The concrete does not only represent progress, it also holds the memory of people who were trapped inside a system where escape was nearly impossible. When petroleum began replacing coal, the reason for Hashima's existence collapsed. In 1974, Mitsubishi closed the mine. The departure was fast. Residents left behind buildings, furniture, classrooms, medical rooms, bathhouses, corridors, and stairwells. The island that had once been crowded with daily life became empty. Rain entered the apartments, windows shattered, concrete cracked under salt and weather, staircases led nowhere, plants pushed through the ruins, the school, the hospital, and the workers' homes remained, but without voices they looked less like abandoned architecture, and more like evidence after an evacuation no one had time to explain. For years, Hashima was closed to the public. That restriction deepened its legend. Photographs from the island showed a dead city at sea, a place where modern civilization had been reduced to gray skeletons of concrete. The silence became part of the story. People imagined footsteps in corridors, faces in broken windows, and the weight of miners who had gone underground and never fully returned in memory. Even without supernatural claims, Hashima carried a haunting force because the island showed what happens when human life is organized entirely around extraction, then discarded when the resource is gone. The consequence of Hashima is not only that an island was abandoned, the deeper consequence is that a whole human system was built, compressed, exploited, and left to decay inside seawalls. The island forces a question that industry rarely wants to answer. When a place is created only to feed a machine, what happens to the people who become part of that machine? Hashima Island still stands in the ocean like a concrete warning. Not because the island is empty, but because the island looks as if it is waiting for someone to admit what the silence is made of. Ōkunoshima Island. In the 1920s, in the Sado Inland Sea of Japan, a small island only about 2.5 miles around was quietly removed from ordinary memory. Ōkunoshima looked harmless from a distance. The island had green hills, rocky shores, narrow roads, military ruins, and calm water surrounding it on all sides. Today, many visitors know Ōkunoshima as Rabbit Island, a place where hundreds of tame rabbits move through grass, pathways, and abandoned concrete structures. But beneath that soft image lies one of the darkest industrial secrets in modern Japanese history. For years, Ōkunoshima was not a place of tourism. It was a hidden factory for poison gas. The choice of the island was deliberate. Ōkunoshima was isolated enough to conceal activity, but close enough to shipping routes and military infrastructure to remain useful. The surrounding sea acted like a natural wall. Anyone approaching could be noticed. Anyone working inside could be controlled. During the early years of Japan's chemical weapons program, secrecy became part of the island's architecture. Facilities were built, workers were brought in. The island's purpose changed from ordinary land to a concealed engine of war. The most disturbing detail is that Ōkunoshima was reportedly erased from some maps during the period of operation. Whether that erasure was complete or selective, the meaning was clear. A place that officially disappears becomes easier to deny. The island did not need legends to become frightening. Its terror came from bureaucracy, chemistry, and silence. Poison gas does not roar like artillery. It spreads invisibly. It enters lungs, eyes, skin, and memory before the victim fully understands what has happened. Ōkunoshima was tied to that invisible kind of warfare. The physical remains still carry the mood of that history. Concrete storage buildings stand with dark openings where doors once sealed dangerous materials inside. Brick ruins sit among trees, cracked by roots and weather. Old power plant structures rise like hollow shells, their windows empty, their walls stained by time. Rusted fragments and sealed areas suggest a place that was never meant to be fully explained to outsiders. The island is bright in daylight, but the ruins give the landscape a strange double image. Rabbits move calmly through grass near buildings, connected to weapons designed to make human bodies collapse. The workers who served the island's factories were also trapped inside the secrecy of the program. Many were exposed to hazardous materials. Protective equipment was limited by modern standards. Some later suffered health problems connected to the chemicals produced there. Their labor was hidden behind military necessity. Their suffering did not fit the clean version of national history that governments often prefer to remember. When war ended, the facilities were dismantled, burned, dumped, or abandoned. Documents were destroyed, materials were removed. The island's dangerous past was not displayed proudly. It was buried under silence. Then came the rabbits. Their exact origin on the island is debated, but their presence transformed Ōkunoshima's public image. They became the face of the island, softening a place once defined by toxic production. Visitors arrived with food and cameras. The ruins became a background. The poison gas museum became a warning. The island became two things at once: a quiet tourist destination and a reminder that the most frightening places do not always look frightening. That contrast is what makes Ōkunoshima so unsettling. Poveglia and North Brother Island feel dark because abandonment is visible. Hashima feels dark because the concrete ruins look like a dead city. But Ōkunoshima hides darkness behind gentleness. A rabbit crossing a path may stand only a few feet from the remains of a factory that produced invisible weapons. The island does not announce its horror. It allows beauty and memory to occupy the same ground. The consequence of Ōkunoshima is not only the poison gas that was once produced there. The deeper consequence is the way a nation can hide an island, use it for a secret war, then later allow innocence to grow over the evidence. If a place can be removed from maps, filled with chemical weapons, and then remembered mainly for rabbits, what else can history disguise when the surface becomes peaceful enough? Ōkunoshima is not terrifying because it looks cursed. Ōkunoshima is terrifying because it proves that some of the darkest islands are the ones that learned how to smile. Sable Island. In 1801, about 110 miles southeast of Nova Scotia, a narrow crescent of sand in the North Atlantic was given a permanent rescue station because too many ships had vanished around its shores. Sable Island did not look like a monster from a distance. The island was low, pale, and shifting, a long sandbar about 26 miles across, surrounded by gray water, fog, storms, and dangerous shoals. But sailors learned to fear Sable Island for one reason. The island did not need cliffs, cannons, or reefs rising above the waves. Sable Island waited just beneath the surface, where a ship could be lost before the crew understood what had happened. For centuries, Sable Island became known as the Graveyard of the Atlantic. The title was not given because of one disaster, but because of a repeated pattern. Ships crossing the North Atlantic could be driven off course by fog, wind, currents, or bad navigation. Then, when crews believed they were still in open water, the hull would strike sand. A vessel could become trapped, broken, and swallowed by surf while land remained barely visible through mist. The island was close enough to offer hope, yet dangerous enough to turn that hope into panic. The physical shape of Sable Island made the danger worse. The island was not fixed like stone. Sand moved, dunes shifted, storms reshaped the coastline. Shoals extended far into the sea like hidden fingers. A map could become outdated because the island itself seemed to change. This made Sable Island feel less like land and more like a living trap, a place where geography refused to stay still long enough to be mastered. Survivors of wrecks faced a second horror after the impact. Reaching the island did not mean safety. Sable Island had little shelter, few trees, fierce winds, and a landscape of sand, grass, salt spray, and freezing exposure. In storm season, the island could feel like a strip of earth abandoned between two violent worlds, the ocean on one side and the ocean on the other. Men who survived the wreck might still die waiting for rescue. Cargo could be scattered, bodies could be buried in sand, wreckage could disappear under dunes until only rumors remained. The island also carried a strange contrast. Wild horses roamed across Sable Island, giving the landscape an almost dreamlike image. To one viewer, the horses made the island beautiful. To another, they made the island even more unsettling. A place known for shipwrecks, death, and isolation was also home to quiet animals moving through grass and fog, as if nothing human had ever mattered there. The horses became part of the legend, silent witnesses to disasters the sea had already erased. Rescue stations, lighthouses, and life-saving crews eventually reduced the number of deaths, but they could not remove the island's reputation. Sable Island remained restricted, remote, and difficult to reach. Scientists, conservation workers, and authorized visitors could study the weather, wildlife, and shifting dunes. But for the imagination, the island remained something older than research. It remained the place where ships went off course and history broke apart in the surf. The consequence of Sable Island is not only the number of wrecks linked to its waters. The deeper consequence is that Sable Island proves nature can create a legend without needing a curse. Fog, sand, wind, current, and human error were enough. Yet when the same place destroys ship after ship, generation after generation, people begin to wonder whether geography alone can explain the pattern. Sable Island may not be haunted by spirits. Sable Island may be haunted by repetition. And in the North Atlantic, repetition can become more frightening than any ghost story. Snake Island. In the early 20th century, about 20 miles off the coast of São Paulo, Brazil, fishermen began speaking of an island that seemed too dangerous for ordinary human life. Ilha de Queimada Grande was not large, only about 106 acres of forest, rock, steep coastline, and Atlantic heat. From a distance, the island looked green and silent, surrounded by blue water and rough landing points. But the closer people came, the more the island's reputation changed. This was not a place feared because of ruins, hospitals, shipwrecks, or abandoned machinery. This was an island where nature itself appeared to have closed the door. The legend of Ilha de Queimada Grande centers on one creature, the golden lancehead pit viper. The snake is found only on this island, which makes the island feel like a sealed biological chamber. Its pale yellow-brown body can blend with branches, leaves, and stone. Its triangular head, heat-sensing pits, and venomous bite give the island a threat that does not need to be imagined. Unlike a ghost story, this danger has scales, fangs, and a measurable biological reality. The most repeated claim is that the island contains an extremely high concentration of snakes, though exact numbers have varied across reports and studies. Popular stories make the island sound as if every few feet of ground is alive with venom. That image may be exaggerated, but exaggeration is not needed for fear to survive. A remote island with an endemic venomous snake already has enough power to frighten anyone who imagines stepping ashore without help, without a clear path, and without knowing what is hidden under the leaves. The origin of the snakes makes the island even more unsettling. Thousands of years ago, rising sea levels likely separated the island from the mainland, trapping the ancestors of these snakes in isolation. With no large mammals to hunt, the snakes adapted to a different food source: birds. That adaptation helped shape the venom and behavior that made the golden lancehead infamous. The island became a natural laboratory where evolution continued without human permission. Over time, Ilha de Queimada Grande was no longer simply an island near Brazil. It became a place where isolation created something the mainland did not have. Dark legends soon grew around the danger. One story tells of a fisherman who landed on the island and was later found dead in his boat, blood marking the desperate attempt to escape. Another tells of a lighthouse keeper and his family killed after snakes entered their home. These stories are difficult to confirm in every detail, and that uncertainty only makes them stronger as legends. They express the same warning in different forms. People who underestimate the island do not leave the island unchanged, if they leave at all. Eventually, access became restricted. Brazilian authorities limited visits to approved researchers and controlled personnel, partly to protect people and partly to protect the golden lancehead itself. This restriction gave the island a forbidden status. Unlike abandoned islands where tourists chase fear, Ilha de Queimada Grande remains dangerous in a practical sense. The island does not perform horror for visitors. The island simply exists, and that existence is enough. What makes Ilha de Queimada Grande different from the other islands in this list is that there is no need to invent a curse. The curse is ecological. The surrounding sea became a wall. The forest became a hiding place. Evolution became the author of the legend. Human imagination only gave the island a name that matched what people already felt. Snake Island. The consequence of Ilha de Queimada Grande is not just that humans avoid it. The deeper consequence is that the island reminds us how quickly nature can become unreadable when human control disappears. On the mainland, people build roads, homes, hospitals, and fences to make danger feel managed. But on this island, the old illusion collapses. The human body is no longer the dominant force. It is only another warm shape moving through leaves. If Ilha de Queimada Grande is surrounded by a dark legend, the legend is not that monsters live there. The legend is that the island never needed monsters at all. Ramree Island. In 1945, off the western coast of Burma, now Myanmar, Ramree Island became the setting for one of the darkest and most disputed legends of the Second World War. The island was not an empty wilderness. Ramree Island held villages, mangrove swamps, muddy channels, thick vegetation, and coastal ground that could shift from solid land to drowning trap within a few steps. But during the final phase of the Burma campaign, the island became a battlefield. British and Allied forces fought Japanese troops across terrain, where the enemy was not only armed men, but heat, disease, darkness, and the swamp itself. The most infamous story begins after Japanese forces were pushed back and attempted to escape across the mangrove swamps. According to the legend, hundreds of soldiers entered the wetlands at night, trying to break through towards safety. What waited inside the swamp was not only mud and insects. Ramree Island was home to saltwater crocodiles, among the largest and most aggressive reptiles in the world. In later accounts, the retreat became a nightmare of screams, gunfire, splashing water, and bodies dragged beneath the surface. The image is almost too horrifying to separate from myth. Men exhausted by battle moved through waist-deep water, tangled roots, and black mud. Mosquitoes filled the air, leeches clung to skin. The smell of salt, rot, and blood mixed under the tropical heat. In the darkness, a soldier could hear movement without knowing whether it came from another man, a shifting branch, or something waiting with only its eyes above the water. Every step could sink deeper. Every sound could reveal a position. The swamp did not offer cover. It turned cover into a prison. The crocodile story became one of the most repeated wartime horror tales connected to any island. Some versions claim that nearly 1,000 Japanese soldiers were killed by crocodiles. Other historians argue that the numbers were exaggerated, and that many deaths came from combat, starvation, dehydration, wounds, exposure, and disease. This uncertainty is what makes Ramree Island so powerful as a dark legend. The factual battle was already brutal. The environment was already deadly. The crocodiles may have been real, but the scale of the attack remains debated. That debate does not weaken the story. It makes the story more disturbing. War often produces legends because human memory tries to shape chaos into scenes that can be repeated. On Ramree Island, the swamp became the perfect symbol for a military collapse. Soldiers entered a landscape where command, discipline, and strategy began to lose meaning. The jungle swallowed units. The mud slowed retreat. The water hid predators. What happened there could be explained by military records, survivor accounts, animal behavior, and rumor. But none of those explanations fully removes the terror. Ramree Island also reveals how battlefields become haunted without needing ghosts. A beach, a forest, or a swamp can absorb violence so completely that later generations stop seeing it as ordinary geography. The island becomes a place where fear is attached to mud, roots, and water. Even if the crocodile deaths were fewer than legend claims, the idea of trapped soldiers crossing a living swamp under enemy pressure remains almost unbearable. The consequence of Ramree Island is not only the disputed number of dead. The deeper consequence is that the island shows how war can transform nature into an execution chamber. A swamp that once belonged to tides, birds, reptiles, and fishermen became remembered as a place where men disappeared into black water, while history argued over the details. If the legend is exaggerated, then Ramree Island proves how horror grows around war. But if even part of the story is true, then one question remains in the mangroves. How many screams were lost there before anyone could decide whether they belonged to history or to legend? Lost at Clipperton Island. In 1914, more than 600 miles off the coast of Mexico, a tiny coral atoll in the eastern Pacific became the center of a human nightmare that almost disappeared from history. Clipperton Island was not a paradise. It was a ring of land surrounding a stagnant lagoon with rough surf, sharp coral, seabirds, crabs, low vegetation, and almost no natural shelter. From above, the island looked like a fragile mark on the ocean. From the ground, it felt like a trap. There was no safe harbor, no reliable fresh water, and no easy escape once supply ships stopped coming. The settlement on Clipperton existed because people believed the island had value. Guano deposits, strategic location, and national claims turned the lonely atoll into something governments and companies could use. Workers, soldiers, and families were sent there to hold the island, maintain a presence, and prove that the land belonged to someone. But ownership means very little when a place is surrounded by thousands of square miles of water, and survival depends entirely on the next ship. When the Mexican Revolution disrupted supply lines, Clipperton's isolation became deadly. Food shipments failed, communication weakened, promises from the mainland became meaningless. The people on the island waited for rescue that did not come. Hunger spread through the settlement. Scurvy, exhaustion, and desperation followed. The island's lagoon, once part of its strange geography, became a symbol of imprisonment. It held water, but not the kind that could save them. The physical landscape made every day worse. The sun hit the coral with brutal intensity. Salt wind damaged skin and supplies. Crabs moved across the ground in overwhelming numbers. Birds circled and nested as if the island belonged more to them than to the human beings trapped there. The sea was everywhere, but it did not offer freedom. Waves broke violently against the reef, making departure almost impossible without the right vessel. Clipperton Island was surrounded by water that could not be crossed, food that could not be counted on, and silence that kept growing heavier. As the settlement collapsed, deaths followed. Men left in search of help and did not return. Disease and starvation reduced the community. Then the island's darkest legend formed around Victoriano Alvarez, the last surviving male authority figure on Clipperton. Later accounts describe him declaring himself ruler over the remaining survivors, using fear and violence to control the desperate group. The details are grim, and some parts of the story have been retold with different emphasis over time. But the core remains chilling. Isolation did not only bring hunger, it broke the structure of civilization itself. In 1917, survivors were finally rescued by the American gunboat USS Yorktown. By then, Clipperton was no longer just a remote atoll. It had become a warning about what happens when humans are abandoned beyond the reach of law, supply, and accountability. The island did not need supernatural forces. The horror came from logistics, politics, neglect, and the slow collapse of order. The consequence of Clipperton Island is that it reveals the cruelty hidden inside the word remote. On a map, distance looks clean. In reality, distance can turn into starvation, silence, madness, and power without witnesses. The island was claimed by nations, used by industries, and occupied by people who believed someone would come back for them. But the ocean made every promise weaker. If Clipperton Island carries a dark legend, it is not because the island was cursed by spirits. It is because the island exposed a more human curse, the terrifying speed at which civilization can vanish when the world stops answering. Roanoke Island. In 1587, on Roanoke Island off the coast of present-day North Carolina, more than 100 English settlers tried to build a permanent colony on the edge of an unfamiliar world. The island was surrounded by shallow sounds, marshes, forests, shifting weather, and the vast uncertainty of the Atlantic frontier. To the settlers, Roanoke Island was supposed to become a beginning. To history, it became one of the most famous disappearances ever recorded in North America. The colony was led by John White, who arrived with men, women, and children, hoping to create a lasting English settlement. This was not only a military outpost. It included families. It included a newborn child, Virginia Dare, often remembered as the first English child born in the Americas. That detail makes Roanoke more unsettling than many other island mysteries. The vanished colony was not just a group of explorers who accepted danger. It was a fragile community trying to turn wilderness into home. But survival on Roanoke Island was never simple. Supplies were limited. Relations with nearby indigenous communities were complex and strained by previous English expeditions. Food, disease, weather, misunderstanding, and fear all pressed against the settlement. The island's geography added to the pressure. Water separated the colonists from immediate escape, but the land around them was not empty. Every decision depended on cooperation, knowledge of the environment, and help from people the English often failed to understand. John White left the colony later in 1587 and returned to England for supplies. He expected to come back quickly. Instead, war between England and Spain delayed his return for years. When White finally reached Roanoke Island again in 1590, he did not find a struggling colony waiting for rescue. He found silence. The houses had been dismantled. The settlement was empty. There were no bodies, no clear signs of battle, no desperate final message carved into a door. The only clue was the word Croatoan carved into a post and the letters CRO carved into a tree. Before leaving, White had told the colonists to carve a cross if they were forced to depart under attack. No cross was found. That missing symbol became as important as the word itself. It suggested departure, but not necessarily destruction. Croatoan referred to a nearby island and an indigenous group known to the English. One logical explanation is that the colonists moved and joined, or tried to join, local communities. Other theories suggest starvation, disease, massacre, shipwreck, forced migration, or gradual absorption into indigenous populations. Archaeological research has searched for traces, but the complete story remains unresolved. Roanoke Island became famous not because there are no explanations, but because no explanation has fully closed the wound. The physical setting deepens the legend. Roanoke was not a stone fortress swallowed by jungle or a city buried by ash. It was a vulnerable island settlement made of timber, dirt paths, fences, supplies, and hope. The disappearance left almost nothing dramatic behind. That emptiness is what made the case endure. A colony can burn, and history can study the ashes. A colony can be massacred, and history can count the dead. But Roanoke left a carved word and a silence large enough for centuries of fear. The consequence of Roanoke Island is not only that settlers vanished. The deeper consequence is that the island marks a moment when empire met a land it did not understand and then lost control of its own story. The English arrived expecting to claim a future. Instead, the island kept the final chapter. If the colonists survived, their history may have been absorbed into another world and erased by later records. If they died, Roanoke Island hid the evidence with terrifying efficiency. Either way, one question remains carved into the edge of American memory. Was Croatoan a clue left for rescue, or the last trace of a people already gone? Conclusion: these islands reveal a disturbing pattern. They are not feared only because they are surrounded by water. They are feared because each one became a container for something people could not easily face. Disease was sent to Poveglia and North Brother Island. Industry consumed Hashima until the island was left as a concrete corpse. Poison gas was hidden on Ōkunoshima behind military silence. Sable Island turned natural geography into a repeated trap for ships. Ilha de Queimada Grande showed how evolution can create a place where humans no longer belong. Ramree Island turned war into a legend of mud, blood, and predators. Clipperton exposed how fast civilization can collapse when rescue never comes. Roanoke left only a word carved into wood, and a disappearance large enough to haunt an entire nation. What connects them is not one curse, one ghost, or one explanation. It is isolation. On an island, fear has nowhere to spread except inward. Rumors become stronger. Death becomes harder to verify. Records vanish more easily. Survivors become the only witnesses, and sometimes there are no survivors at all. That is why dark legends cling to islands so tightly. The sea protects the mystery. Distance protects the silence. And once people decide a place should not be visited, the legend begins to guard itself. The real question is not whether these islands are haunted. The real question is why so many of them became places where humanity left its worst memories behind, then pretended the ocean had washed them clean.